Chapter 15, Fancywork versus the Printed Word. With my usual bad management, when I moved to the ranch, I took with me a box of old school and children's books instead of my own books. At first, in loneliness and desperation, I read The Five Little Peppers, Alden's Encyclopedia, and The Way of All Flesh, separately, together, alternately, over and over. I also read magazines, the newspapers, and any and all catalogs. I couldn't borrow books because my neighbors never read. Reading was a sign of laziness, boastfulness, and general degradation. Mountain farm women did fancy work. They embroidered their dish towels and then bleached them so that they always looked mended. They embroidered their pillowcases with hard, scratchy knots and flowers. They embroidered every stitch their babies wore, and they embroidered, tattered, crocheted, and otherwise disfigured their own underclothing, handkerchiefs, doilies, bureau scarves, bedspreads, sheets, and napkins. They called it embroid-drying, and I said, I'm going embroidery me some pillow slips. They were at it from infancy to the grave. But as I don't like embroidery in any form, I resolved that they could cross-stitch me to the cross, and I would not learn. I'm the type of female the pioneers were tickled pink to give to the Indians as a hostage. I wrote long, pleading letters to my family to sort out and send on my books, but we were far from any main roads, and the sending of anything over mailing size involved so many people and so many arrangements with bus companies, ferries, individual bus drivers, farmers on the route, that we finally decided against sending the books. Mother promised they would bring them on the first visit. On the first visit, they came so loaded with candy, cigarettes, fruit, magazines, and presents for the house that I was ashamed to mention the books, which they had obviously forgotten. Subsequent visits proved like the first. We correspond feverishly about the books between visits, sending lists back and forth and fighting via mail over who owned what books. But they were always forgotten. Quote, left on the front porch, and quote, left in the garage, and quote, stacked in the front hall, end quote. They lamented, but I knew better. In the first place, most of them were loaned to people. No one ever remembered to whom, like the first edition of Ambrose Bierce's Devil's Dictionary, which we were never able to track down. And in the second place, packing books is not a chore that anyone undertakes just for the sheer joy of it, so it was always put off until the actual time of departure, then forgotten. Each time we went to town, I looked in vain for a lending library and intended to locate the public library, and each time we returned to the farm with the chicken feed and groceries, but without any books. If Bob hadn't parked the car where he did one wet, blowy Saturday that first November, we probably never would have found the book stall crouching on the main street between the cheese factory and the barber shop. Look, I shouted to Bob excitedly, a new industry. And I pointed to the slightly crooked sign timidly spelling out the name. After we had been to the bookstall, we realized that though it was a new enterprise, something of a miracle in town, its opening was very much like putting another bunch of faded flowers on a grave. The bookstall's door opened the wrong way, so that I was jammed against the wall, fighting for my breath and knocking things off the shelves before I was decently inside. Miss Wetter, the owner-manageress, exuded Sloane's liniment and seemed to be trying to gather herself together. She was very thin, some age over 35, and had a broken tear duct in her right eye. She continually lifted up her glasses and wiped the eye, pulled up her skirt at the waist, and pulled down her cardigan. She was very deaf and had adenoids. Her stock, her prices, and her spirits were very low. I looked over the stock, which, judging from the titles, had been left her by a deceased relative. There were several Lives of Christ, Brewster's Millions, The Broad Highway by Geoffrey Farnell, Zoroaster by Frances Marion Crawford, The Sheik, a few of Eleanor Glynn, Zane Grey, Kathleen Norris. There were some little books of poetry with covers of brilliantly colored flowers. My Book of Poems with pansies on the covers. Poems I Love with forget-me-nots, and Hand in Hand with daisies. There were also some children's books, some very odd histories, and a dictionary or two. The only thing I could say for the bookstall's stock was that in comparison, the telephone directory seemed like very good reading. I asked for a detective story. My exact words were, "Do you have any detective stories?" Miss Weather said, "It's Bitey Dice Work. I beat lots of dice people." I said louder, "Do you have any mystery stories?" She said, "Ad ba'od." So apparently was I. I yelled, "Crime stories! Mysteries! Detectives!" She shuffled through the drawer in the front of her desk, and at last, locating a little notebook, she smiled brightly and said, $1 a month for 2 books at a time." So I fished an old envelope out of my purse and wrote out a list of books I wanted, paid my $1, and bought some new magazines. As I left, Miss Weather took off her glasses for the 8th time, dabbed at the watery eye, and remarked enigmatically, "I'm only on page 72. Felt like a kid replying, "Kid, you're farther behind than you'll ever know." 2 weeks later, I went to town again and sought out Miss Weather. She had installed a smelly coal oil heater, but other than that, it was Act 2. Same scene, same costume, same books. Didn't hear a word I said and was studying my list as though I had given it to her a half an hour ago instead of 15 days before. Again, I wrote everything down, but I was not absolutely certain she wasn't also blind. We continued this way until well into February. Then I begged Bob to go in to the book stall with me to see what he can do with Miss Weather. He balked at first, saying that he didn't see of what use he could be unless I wanted him to turn her upside down and shake the books out of her. But I gave him my pleading setter look, and in we went. Bob turned on a full 150 watts of charms, did not raise his naturally husky voice a quarter tone, and darned if she didn't understand every word he said. With a minimum of eye dabbing and cardigan jerking, she produced 2 mystery stories, only one of which I had read. She also told him, ignoring me, that she had recently bought out a very prosperous circulating library and was expecting the books in a day or so. Bob was courtly to the point of almost kissing her hand. I was so elated over the coming books that I was graciously able to ignore her ignoring me, and Miss Weather glowed until I thought her veins would burst their seams. From that day forward, Bob had wonderful luck with Miss Weather, and came home loaded with books and pamphlets on making the small farm pay, coccidiosis, its cause and cure, how many chickens can one man handle, and so forth for him, and the first thing either of them could lay their hands on for me. The mythical library, which he was supposed to have purchased, failed to materialize, while I had traffic with Miss Weather, or else, as I expected the time she told us of the deal, the new library was the twin sister of her own, and the new Lives of Christ and Types of Manure and How to Know Them melted into her own stock and became indistinguishable, including in one offering for me, selected by Mrs. Weather and delivered by Bob, were Opera Made Easy for Tiny Tots and Tom Brown at Rugby. All I can say for Miss Weather is that if her library was circulating, I should hate to see one at a standstill. Late that second summer, Miss Weather sent me a series of articles which she had clipped from some paper, with malice afterthought, about a woman and her very aimless husband, who by their own choice lived out of the reaches of civilization on the Pacific coast. This woman was a very, very good sport about everything, including eating seaweed and not having her husband work. She didn't have lights, water, radio, toilet, bathtub, movies, neighbors, or money. And she just loved it. Miss Wetter sent it to me. I'm sure, and perhaps Bob had a finger in it too, for the purpose of bringing to light my own bad sportsmanship. But it was a wasted effort. The articles affected me the same way as a book which dear grandmother sent Mary and Cleve and me when we were children. It was a slender book with a dark red cover filled with good thoughts and illustrated with steel engravings. There were, quote, birds in their little nests agree, end quote. Quote, how doth the little busy bee, end quote. Quote, many hands make light work, end quote. Quote, we live in deeds, not years, end quote. Quote, early to bed and early to rise, end quote, and others of that ilk. We didn't care much for the book, for the pictures were ugly and the content was dull. Anyway, we liked Slovenly Peter, which its fascinating pictures of children with their eyes coming out and their legs broken off, and all of the characters thoroughly bad. But there was one thought and picture in the little red book of good thoughts which absolutely infuriated us. The verse said, if at first you don't succeed, try again. And the picture was of a smug, near-together-eyed girl sitting on a little stool, her buttoned, picky-toed shoes crossed primly, sewing doll clothes. The doll dress on which she was sewing was of the round hole for the head, stovepipe sleeve variety, and scattered on the floor around the nasty little girl were dozens of shapeless dresses, which she had apparently spoiled. By the time I was halfway through the second article by Miss I Love Hardships, she had become the near-together-eyed little good thoughts girl grown up. I don't mind people making the best of inconveniences. In fact, I admired that quality in this woman, and the articles would have been fine if she had let it go at that. But no, she had to become so hysterically happy that she made living out of doors in the winter up here sound like a vacation in Tahiti. She said that they didn't even build a shelter. They just slept on the ground, so they could be close to nature and had only the trees and the stars for walls and a roof. That was too much. I threw the articles across the room, for anyone in this region knows that from the 1st of September until the last of June, we either have to have a roof and 4 walls or a coating of duck feathers. And if we lay on the ground and looked heavenward, as she said they did, for more than 15 minutes at a stretch, we'd drown. I was so incensed by this misrepresentation that I told Mrs. Kettle about it. I said, this woman said that they lay on the ground outside the year round. Mrs. Kettle evidently missed the point, for she said, well, she's got a nerve writing about it. Murdy Williams laid up outside with Chet Andrews and her old men caught him, and there was hell to pay. He was shot, Chet, but he been having trouble, with Murdy anyways, so he was glad to have the excuse to get her married. Mrs. Kettle was working on a patchwork quilt, seated in the black leather rocker around which the floor had been thickly carpeted with newspapers. She was sewing small octagonal pieces of gingham about an inch in diameter on a clean bleached feed sack. The center of the design was an octagon sewn to a large octagon of plain color. From each point of the center were sewn pieces, and to each of their points more pieces. The edges were carefully turned under and the piece attached to the large octagon and to the feed stack by tiny stitches. From Mrs. Kettle's ample lap cascaded a large finished section of the quilt. It was very attractive. I said as much, and Mrs. Kettle said, I made these here quilts every year since I was married. Got them in the closet in the spare room. I figure it'll be something real nice to leave the kids when I die. You ought to take up quilting instead of reading them damn full books all the time. Piecing a quilt is real quiet in work. Here, let me show you how. She reached down at her side and produced a clean folded feed sack and a large blue octagon. She threaded me a needle and started me attaching a large octagon to the feed sack. She reached behind her and pulled the coffee pot to the front of the stove, and then we settled down with our sewing. Mrs. Kettle said, "When I sit and sew like this, I think about things. When I was first married, I was neat and clean and tried to keep my whole house and my kids clean. But Pa's a awful lazy old bastard, and it was fight all the time to get him to fix the fences, clean the barn, wipe his feet, change his clothes. And finally I gave up. I says to myself, I can't make Pa change and be neat, so I'll have to change and be dirty, or it'll be fight all our lives. So I got easier and found it don't really matter one way or the other. Sure, he tracks in manure, and he don't clean the barn, and last week the cheese factory sent us a warning about dirt in the ice cream. But he's a real good-natured, and he's never lifted a hand to one of the kids. And anyway, I don't see that Bertie Hicks is much better off with her Chrisley scrubbing from dawn to dark." She heaved to her feet and said, "Get some of them rock cookies out of that jar in the corner of the pantry, and I'll pour the coffee." Some time later, I left for home laden with quilt pieces and full directions for the entire layout. I finished one square after dinner, and although I punctured both hands to pulpy masses and was almost blind, I darted about the house holding up the square to see the effect of piece quilt walls, piece quilt curtains, piece quilt doilies. Bob refused to evidence any enthusiasm over this wonderful new accomplishment of mine, and stolidly read aloud from the American Poultryman an unusually dull article on coccidiosis stopping dead at the end of every line, regardless of the content. The clock on the shelf above the kitchen sink ticked loudly. The stove shifted position of its wood occasionally. Sport whined plaintively in his sleep. An owl hooted. The coyotes began their nightly howling, and the evening droned on. The next night I firmly placed my piece quilt square in the bottom drawer with, quote, "Just call me Myrtles," end quote, cut-out dresses, sorted over Mrs. Hicks's latest contribution of magazines, and settled down happily with a story about a murder in a nightclub. Mrs. Hicks kindly bestowed on me all of her old magazines. She brought them up to me, well wrapped in her contempt for the printed word. Her excuse for having the nasty things in the house at all was a desire for, quote, "receipts and patrons," and she nearly always managed to not include the end of a serial. In those women's magazines, I read thousands of stories about girls named Ricky, Nicky, or Sticky, and boys named Brent, Kent, and Trent. They all earned enormous salaries in advertising agencies, and the girls, as totally justified rewards for being both dull and usually disagreeable, had great big apartments full of heat, light, and conveniences. The only thing that kept me going as I read these stories day after day was the thought that Ricky, Nicky, and Sticky would probably get their just desserts, whether the authors knew it or not, because Brent, Kent, and Trent, in spite of their prodigious business acumen and witty repartee, were American men, and average, the author implied, and therefore they would either bore Ricky, Nicky, and Sticky to death talking about a little chicken ranch, or they would cash in on some of those $100,000 accounts and buy a little chicken ranch. Then let's see how gay, how smooth, how burnished-headed you are, girls, I would sneer, as I ripped the magazine in two and then carefully put it back together again with transparent tape. so I could read some more stories and get mad the next night. Verna Marie Jefferson, the moonshiner's wife, sent me up hundreds of True Story, True Confession, True Love, Dream World, etc., which she bought for the pictures since she couldn't read. I read them all and was fascinated and ashamed. Here I was complaining, and I didn't know what a problem was. Was Bob a thief? Was Bob a murderer? Did my mother drink? Did my sister smoke doped cigarettes? Then what was I complaining about? To supplement my reading, I wrote letters. I wrote long letters to everyone I knew, and wondered while I was doing it why I, who had nothing to say, was able to fill 4 or 5 pages, while William Lyon Phelps never wrote more than a few meaty lines. Among the letters I received were monthly ones from dear grandmother addressed to dear child bride, which I found intensely annoying because it brought to mind pictures of a 10-year-old girl in pigtails and bare feet being dragged to the altar by a giant hairy brute. I wrote to mother and demanded that she make dear grandmother stop addressing me in this depressing way. But mother characteristically replied, "Why stop her? She enjoys it and it doesn't hurt you." In fact, even mentioning the child bride business to my family was a mistake, for from that time on, all of their letters were addressed, and sometimes on the outside of the envelope, child bride. One time Bob went away on business and left me on the ranch alone overnight. At least he thought he had. It was summer and sultry. I did the chores while great black clouds surged angrily around the mountaintops and the sky became dark and swollen. Coming back from my last trip to the chicken house and with only the ducks and the pig left to feed, I was surprised to find Elwyn Kettle in the yard in one of his old cars with a top. He said, "Ma says there's going to be a storm and she wants you to stay all night at our house. It's okay about the chickens. I'll drive you up first thing in the morning." She said to bring the baby's bottle and come on. I was very touched by her thoughtfulness, but a little apprehensive about sleeping arrangements. I need not have been. Mrs. Kettle took me upstairs to the spare room, which was immaculate, and had a large brass bed with one of the beautiful finished quilts on it for a counterpane, a very pretty braided oval rug on the floor, clean ruffled curtains at the window, and a large bureau with an embroidered bureau scarf, an oblong pincushion with an embroidered cover on it, a mother-of-pearl dresser set, complete with a hair receiver and a picture frame, a very deluxe catalog item, and a vase of large red crepe paper roses. It was very cozy there, with the dark clouds outside the window bumping into each other and grumbling menacingly, and the wind whining in the treetops. Mrs. Kettle showed me the closet full of quilts, and the baby shoes and hair of each of the children, the bureau drawers packed with Christmas presents all in their original boxes, and never used, and consisting mostly of nightgowns with heavy tatted yokes, towel and wash rag sets, guest towels, and crocheted doilies. By the time we had finished examining everything, the storm had broken, and the thunder roared, and the lightning flashed, and the rain hammered relentlessly on the roof over our heads. Mrs. Kettle had to leave me to get out the leak pans, since the roof had begun to leak some 10 years before. Pa hadn't gotten around to fixing it, and each year the winds tore off more shingles, and the leaks increased until it reached a state where she kept a great stack of cans and pans in the upper hall. At the first drop of rain, she distributed them over the upstairs. Ann and I were assigned 2 empty coffee cans, one at the foot of the bed and one in the closet. As I undressed the baby and got her ready for bed, the pink, pink of the leaks dripping into the cans played a little tune. After I had given Ann her bottle and settled her for the night, I joined the Kettles in the kitchen. The chores were done, and they were all gathered around the kitchen table. reading the local papers and talking about the dance to which the older boys were going and which was 70 miles away. The only car that was running had no lights, and Elwyn intended to drive it over the mountain roads by sense of smell, evidently. Ma protested mildly. She said, "Elwyn, you turned over 3 cans on that road, and 2 of them are at the bottom of the gulch. You were just lucky you turned over where you did. You go running off the road up by the old logging works, and you won't come limping home with only a busted arm." Elwood said, "Oh, I know that road like a hook." Ma said, "Well, what page was you on when you run off the road the last 3 times?" Elwood said, "Well, once I had a blowout, and once the axle broke. The other time I skidded." Pa said, "Just remember, son, you pay for your own funeral." Elwyn said sulkily, "Well, what am I supposed to do? Climb out of my coffin and go to work until I get enough for the funeral?" Everyone laughed, and Pa said, "It ain't no laughing matter. How about some supper, Ma?" So Ma and I brought to the table great bowls of plain boiled navy beans, boiled macaroni, and fried potatoes. Already on the table were pickles, bread, canned peaches, and rock cookies. We all had cups of coffee, which was strong but not venomous, since a French pot had been made just after I arrived. After supper, Ma and I read up the dishes, but we couldn't wash them right away, for the older boys had to wash very lightly and comb their hair at the sink in preparation for the dance. When they had finally left with admonitions to be home before milking time and to drive slowly, wasted breath, Ma and I washed the dishes while Pa and the 3 little boys took a bicycle apart in one corner of the kitchen. The area back of the stove and around the wood box showed no evidences of the brooding it had done earlier in the year. But there was a very heady odor in that vicinity because of the wet barn clothes of Pa, the work clothes of the boys steaming behind the stove, and many pairs of work shoes drying on the oven door. Heady odor or not, the Kettles' kitchen had a warm human feeling in comparison with my own clean, lonely kitchen further up the mountain. The Kettles, owing no doubt to their struggle for existence, had developed strong family ties, and they had generously, for this stormy evening, allowed me to become one of them. It was us Kettles against the world. Ma and I sewed on her quilt and occasionally put wood in the stove and sneered at everyone who had more worldly goods than the Kettles. 72 poles Charlie Johnson had to buy to bring electricity to their ranch, and he had to help set 'em too. But did that satisfy Nettie? No. She had to have a electric stove, a washing machine, electric iron, vacuum cleaner. Jesus Christ, I says to her. You think you was a invalid? I washed for 15 kids and done it all on a board and with a hand wringer, and I ain't in a hospital yet, I says to her. I was up there yesterday, Pa said, as he stirred some vile-smelling, tire-mending concoction on the stove. And Charlie was butchering, and I asked him for the spare ribs because they're killed 2 pigs, and I know that the 2 of them couldn't eat all them spare ribs. But that thingy skunk said, "The reason I'm butchering Mr. Kettle is because I need the meat." I was so mad, I forgot the egg math I borrowed. Ma said, "Well, I would have told him to take them spare ribs and stuff them." I said, "What else could they do with all of those spare ribs?" Ma says, "I suppose they give them some of Nettie's relations. She's related to every son of a bitch in the country." I said, "Well, anyway, when we butcher Gertrude and Elmer, our pigs, I'll give you all the spare ribs you can eat." Ma said, "You and Bob are real good neighbors, Betty, but honest to God, some of these bastards don't seem to know what the word neighbor means. Pull that coffee pot to the front of the stove, Pa." About 9:30, we all retired. I had on my outing flannel pajamas and was just about to blow out my candle when Ma called to me to come to their bedroom across the hall. I took my candle and tiptoed out into the hall, which ran the full length of the house and from which opened 8 doors, not counting my room or Mrs. Kettle's. I was a little hesitant about going in, but Ma was standing by the window, in a voluminous outing flannel gown. Beckoning to me, "Put your candle on the dresser and come here," she said in a vibrant whisper. She had the window open wide, and the wet night air carried the sweet smells of wet earth and evening-scented stock, which grew in a great clump below Mrs. Kettle's window. She said, "Look there, down by the south gate." The lightning struck the old maple. I looked and made out the outline of half the maple lying across the road. The other half hung torn and bleeding against the pale summer evening sky. The rain had stopped while we were at supper, and all that reminded me of the storm were the dying tree and the splat, splat, splat of the dripping eaves. Ma stared morbidly at the fallen tree for a few minutes more, then carefully closing and locking the window, took her candle from the dresser and put it on a chair beside the bed. From the bed came the rhythmic beat of heavy breathing and occasional gulp, gulp, snort of a broken snore. Pa had evidently fallen asleep as soon as he touched the pillow, and he must have been very tired, for I noted that he wore a felt hat pulled down well over his ears and the usual layers of dirty underwear and dirty sweaters. Ma sat heavily down on her side of the bed, causing Pa to spring up and slant alarmingly, but not to waken. She said, "Pa always wears a hat in bed. He says his head gets cold." I realized suddenly that I had been staring in rude fascination at Pa, whose mustache twittered on the ends with each gulp and snort, while his eyebrows drew together menacingly with each indrawn breath. I hastily picked up my candle and left. As I eased in beside small Anne and laid my check on one of Mrs. Kettle's best pillow slips, I knew that I would awaken with a basket of flowers imprinted on my right cheek. The French knots hurt the worst, I thought drowsily, as I snuggled deeper and wondered if Pa had taken off his hip boots.